Hello, everyone. Doug Greenwald here with the Convergint Technologies Digital Transformation team. Thank you for attending Insight and specifically this session where we're going to talk about where identity management and secure credentials are headed for what is now becoming the hybrid workforce. And so we're going to talk about a lot of different topics today. More importantly, want to try and educate and get you up to speed on how credentials are evolving to meet the needs of so many things happening, the convergence of physical and logical access control, the movement to the cloud over the last year from a lot of organizations looking to reduce risk on premise and help their workforce be more efficient. So with all that, just a little background on myself. So I've been here at Convergint for a total of 10 years, back on the advanced solutions team since 2019. I specifically spearhead our initiatives around identity assurance, a term we've coined that incorporates everything around identity access management platforms, biometrics, visitor management. And I've also been, somewhat fortunate over the last year to be the one tasked with spearheading all of our COVID solutions. So everything from thermal cameras to reporting, attestation, and the like. So hopefully today, the goal here is to obviously give you some key takeaways. If you're using legacy proximity technologies, what does the roadmap potentially look like for your organization? I definitely want to address that convergence again of physical and logical access, but more importantly, also address some of the mobile and biometric use cases that are becoming more prevalent. And we're going to address what could also be a supply chain issue with regards to smart chips in the market today. We're going to talk a little bit about what our current and largest enterprises are experiencing, what their current state of their environment looks like, and where they're headed, to give you an idea of maybe checks and balances about where your organization is at, and some thought process to maybe start to look at as far as go forward. So with that, I want to kind of start here and just address how changes over the last year have been driving the market. And that market specifically has a lot to do with what's transpired with COVID. We're seeing a lot of organizations having to first adjust to this new normal, which incorporates workplace safety and workplace, management type tools to allow for people to come back to the office. And this has created a new database, a tremendous amount of new information, everything from employee health data to self-attestation applications to workspace planning and efficiency. All of that together has created more manual processes. And so with that, one of the things that we're going to address today is how do we start to find that single source of truth and perform better identity management, deduplication, and manual entry efforts, and really get to a place where more of the hire to retire and management of an identity is automated and more seamless within the organization. We're also going to talk about, now that the workforce has moved to work from home or even a hybrid model, why physical and logical convergence is so important. I'm going to share a couple of stories that we've heard and seen firsthand, and also talk about what we see some organizations doing to combat that. We'll talk a little bit about this FIDO2 thing. It's coming quickly, especially to the physical security space, and tell you a little bit about what you need to know and how to work with your IT teams to potentially have that be a part of your physical security strategy. And then, of course, we are looking at a lot of cloud adoption over the last year. So all of these things are accelerating change. We're seeing a lot more cloud access and video surveillance providers. And this is all driving, a lot in the identity space and how to kind of manage that. So I think where I'd like to begin is kind of walking through the common current state of our enterprise customers and what that looks like. On the left, you're going to see primarily the identity systems that they're working with, right? So in a lot of cases, large organizations have multiple physical access control systems. They may be working within a legacy HR system, or in the case of many, have already transitioned to a Workday or an SAP that's cloud hosted. On top of that, IT has several identity management tools that they use to be able to manage access to various different systems, SailPoint, Ping Identity being examples within that. Now we're starting to see the prevalence of workplace management tools like Comfy and Locati that allow for space management and planning, so that you've got, in the case of jurisdictions that still have capacity restrictions or organizations that are still erring on the side of caution, bringing people back to the workplace, they are having those folks plan ahead when they're going to visit, validate that they're healthy before coming to the workplace, and also trying to figure out how to provision access for those individuals. We're seeing a lot of people try and use the access control as that governance tool to be able to limit access on specific days to certain employees and grant access to others. So the other challenge too, on top of that, is you still need to have a way to bring visitors and contractors into the facility. And in a lot of cases, a lot of organizations have relied on either standalone or multiple visitor management platforms across the enterprise. Therefore, we've got multiple places where we've got probably duplication of identities, people having different roles within the organization. Maybe contractors have been onboarded as employees and that's not showing correctly across that. So there's a lot of information and detail out there. Well, what are we seeing from a digital transformation perspective across a lot of these organizations where physical security is lagging behind? A lot of those strategic initiatives coming from the enterprise are they want unified systems. They want some sort of single source of truth. They want to see an optimized employee or visitor journey where, especially with the new normal and all the safety protocols, they have to now have one more thing that adds additional anxiety and stress and thought to their day before they even get to the office. So they want that employee journey to be much more streamlined and easier for them to be able to have a positive experience when they come to the office. And of course, every initiative wants to see through the process of innovation and adding new technology to their tech stack, more automation, but compliance in addition to reporting that can simply be utilized across multiple business units. So now we've got a couple of things working against each other. We've got pretty well outlined digital transformation goals across a lot of these enterprises, but some of the core purpose behind that, which is really creating an environment that is easily sustainable and allows for coexistence across multiple platforms, doesn't exist today. And so what this then translates to is you've got a lot of teams that have varied experience or expertise on the systems that they use. So you have to go ask IT to provision somebody. You have to ask your security team to add someone in a lot of cases to the access control system. Have an area manager approve where they can be at what times. And on top of that, all of the correlation between somebody getting termed and that getting populated into the access control, there is a standard right now that we've seen from an SLA perspective that's around 72 hours from the time someone is termed to their access rights being removed in most physical security platforms. From HR to IT, it's been pretty seamless and happens almost in real time. Physical security continues to lag behind in some of those SLAs. On top of that, as I addressed before, there's no single source of truth, which means you have probably a lot of identities that don't even exist within your organization still, and of a lot of identities that may have changed roles or responsibilities that may not have been updated. Why? Well, their card still works. They can still gain access to the front door and to areas of the facility that they always had. And so who's now authorizing access to whom, when, where, and for how long are all questions that sometimes can't be answered through good reporting mechanisms because there's so many systems to have to go to. And of course, obviously, that then lends itself to having multiple different stakeholders or system owners that you have to then rely on to support any reporting or compliance needs that you may have. So out of all of that, it starts to translate to some substantial challenges that create cost inefficiencies that require a lot of manual data entry. And in some cases, some of these systems can't even differentiate between a visitor, a contractor, or even an employee. And what does that end up translating to? Well, a lack of compliance and reporting, especially if you're in the EU and have GDPR considerations. You have to be able to maintain and manage that data very efficiently and acceptably to those guidelines. And Sometimes having so many different disparate systems can start to lose control of that. So one of the other things that plays into this, it's not just about analyzing where things are today. We also want to understand what are some of the risks associated with that. What are some of the barriers to being able to move towards the strategic initiatives outlined? And what do we need to think about from a future demands perspective? How is our workforce evolving? And how is that going to impact potential new technologies that we introduce? So the immediate risk side, right? I mean, that's pretty simple, and it plays into the challenges that I've noted here, right? You've got disparate systems. There's a lot of manual data entry, no single source of truth to understand how many identities across your organization, who has responsibility for all of those, in addition to being very dependent on notifications to understand when you need to take action. On top of that, the barriers that are perceived today are that if I were to try and simplify and consolidate this, it's going to be very costly. I'm going to have a lot of change management process I'm going to have to go to. I'm also going to have, in a lot of cases, when we talk about identity management, the perception and truly the time to value for a lot of those systems have extended 18, 24 months. They're very complex. They can take a long time because they've been built and siloed into an architecture that hasn't been very good about bringing in some of the new cloud solutions. That is starting to change. We're seeing identity management now accelerate their ability to reduce the time to value to mere months now at a highly reduced cost to what they have been in years past. So that perception now is starting to shift away to both the cost and the time that it takes to be able to start to integrate all of these systems has greatly reduced. In the change management process, though there will always be change management when we're introducing new technologies, it is getting more simplistic because it is driving so much on the strategic initiative side that you get executive sponsorship pretty quickly. Now, of course, with all of that, you have to think about how you're future-proofing your organization when introducing any of this. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more is the desire to have mobile credentialing, because for all intents and purposes, people usually don't forget their phone at home, but they will forget their ID badge on a regular basis. On top of that, we also see that physical security and IT security are starting to converge. And what does that mean? Well, we still have a lot of organizations that have smart cards tied to IT that people insert into their laptop that then validates against a variety of different systems within the organization. Well, that same smart card may potentially be able to be used for physical security as well. While the physical security side of the house may still be using legacy proximity cards to gain entry at facility entrances. Now, we all know the risks associated with replicatable and cards that can be copied very easily on the proximity side. So all those things start to play into cleaning up and looking at your security program holistically. I've got a few questions coming through, so I appreciate you guys taking the time, and I guess I'll take a moment here just to pause and reiterate. On the right side of your screen, you can actually see that there's a chat function. You can ask me questions in real time, and on top of that, be able to interact a little bit here. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of questions here. So a question, of course, is real-time reporting one of the most important features of an access control system? To know it's operating as designed, since it's isn't usually commissioned. I'm not sure I'm catching the last part of that question, but I can tell you that absolutely real-time reporting is critical to an access control system. But what tends to not happen is communication either between HR, IT, or area managers back to the security stakeholders to provision or revoke access for identity holders. And in a lot of cases, that process is done very manually. It's either an email or it's a form that's filled out, and sometimes doesn't happen instantaneously. So even though the access control and the team that's operating the SOC is still very nimble and can still see real-time alerting and address alarms, what they don't always get visibility to is who is truly an active user. So that's what plays into trying to figure out how to bring that single source of truth from an identity database perspective into play. We've got another question here. Aren't remote workers putting a strain on IT departments manually monitoring access into various systems at all hours of the day and night, not just 9 to 5? You are absolutely right. There is a new level of effort because, as has been seen over the last year, a lot of people were working from home, right? And when they were working from home, they also had kids at home. And so they would typically have varied hours during the day and would probably plug in earlier in the morning, later at night. I know I fell into that camp during portions of the pandemic. So as a result of that, there is more IT involvement. If I forgot my credentials, I get locked out of my computer because of password challenges or whatever that is, then yes, I'm going to have to reach out to IT at hours outside of normal operating times. So that is putting a strain, and that burden is falling to a variety of people. How much of a risk is an unmanaged cardholder database? And does Convergint offer services to help manage our cardholder database? So in most cases, the database is managed, right? Somebody is always entering or removing identities, but it's usually kicked off through some kind of workflow where it's a notification from, again, an area manager, from HR, from a facility manager, or property manager that's asking someone to provision this individual. Wouldn't it be great if from that source of truth, which you've identified as that standard for the organization, let's take Workday, for example, a new employee is onboarded, their location is identified, and their role within the organization is very clear. Their manager receives an email notification that they just need to approve this user within a single interface. They go in, they say, yep, this is my new employee. I accept the times, days that are going to be working. Once that acceptance occurs, now it's automatically provisioned within the access control as a new user. Notification goes to the security operations team to validate that their access levels and time zones are correct for that individual, and then they can create the credential for them. They can take that physical card, maybe print off a picture on it, and send it to that new worker. So the risk really boils down to, are you getting emails from people within the organization that are legitimate and timely? Secondarily, then on the revocation of access rights, if you are not getting those emails, if an email is missed today, or a notification from ServiceNow that somebody was removed from Active Directory that I need to then take action on, is not handled in real time because I'm dealing with maybe a security incident and not getting in manually, adjusting anything within the access control, well, that opens up potential risk. If I'm a termed employee that still has access to the facility and my card in hand, what is the potential? So that's just one small example of this. But in most cases, the cardholder database isn't necessarily unmanaged. It's just not up to speed with what's happening with the rest of the organization. So with that, let's talk about what kind of the future state and business outcomes can potentially look like when taking all of these identity platforms down into something that's consolidated. Now, that doesn't mean you get rid of Workday or your HR system. It certainly doesn't mean that you get rid of your IT provisioning systems. What it does allow for is opening the door to some type of physical identity access management platform. With that, you're able to have all these connectors, all these databases that correlate against each other using some type of simple, key identifier. That identifier is going to be tied to that identity across all of those systems. And so when someone is provisioned in HR and a location is identified and an area manager is assigned to them, now, instead of working across multiple systems and having to manually make sure that somebody provisioned them into the access control, it automatically kicks off a workflow. And that workflow is totally customizable to whatever your organization is comfortable with, based on the tools and systems that you have in place, and based on the compliance, GDPR data requirements, and ultimately whatever goals that you're trying to achieve from that perspective. So that single source of truth is incredibly important today when you've got so many different platforms, each having their own identities and structures and databases associated with them. It requires you to really start to put some plans in place to reduce the complexity of all that. And on top of that, when you think about all those different PAC systems, so when we think about multiple different access control systems that have been out there and are managed by different facilities, property managers, doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the budget or the time to go and faceless those systems to a single access control platform. So the value is that now those disparate physical access control systems databases are also synced with that single source of truth, whether again, that's HR, IT security, whatever makes the most sense, so that those locations also get provision regardless of the access control system that you've got. And then you can kind of decide as as technology refreshes occur, all of that allows you to kind of work through that as budget and time allows. And it doesn't require you to have to invest a lot in on-premise infrastructure, which, given the state of everything and less people returning to the office and maybe a consolidation of real estate happening, there's actually a lot of value in potentially bringing these systems together from a software perspective rather than going and doing physical hardware upgrades in the field. The other part of this, right, is hire to retire process becomes more automated. It's more expected. It's more real time, especially on the termination side. When you think about the example where right now the industry average is about a 72-hour SLA that someone removes access from the access control system upon notification. Well, what if once they're moved to a term state or their rights are revoked within IT for access to the system? That workflow then kicks off immediate deprovisioning within the access control, rendering any card they may have taken with them useless. That's one of the big value drivers of looking at one of these systems. But that's not the only one, right? This also now opens up the ability to integrate not just to IT, but to other business use cases. As I mentioned before, we've got a lot of people now looking at workspace efficiency platforms to understand how employees actually are using the office as they return to work. Well, that requires a database in and of itself, and it needs to be able to understand which employees work where, at what times, and where were they authorized to be able to go into those locations. What better way to introduce one of those platforms into the organization by having it already tied into an identity management platform? So not only can you understand where people work and if they are indeed an active user in the system, but now you can do better site planning and provisioning and even turn on access, for example, if you need somebody to go to a different site that they're traveling to for whatever reason, more quickly without them having to wait in a lobby for security to give them access to a site that they've already been approved to be at for the day. So a lot of complexity to this topic, right? But I think what I want everyone to start thinking about is that it's getting easier and it's getting faster to be able to bring these systems together. And so hopefully this is just giving you some high level examples of what you might be able to accomplish and start having conversations around within your organization if you feel like you're having some of the challenges that I've outlined. And obviously manual data entry is usually overcome with automation, especially if the fields are mapped correctly. We want to reduce labor requirements. So if it allows you, as your organization scales or becomes more of a hybrid workforce, can you reduce some of the labor elements associated with maintaining these systems? And on top of that, right, when you've got a single credential that can play in the logical and physical space, now it reduces that provisioning and the number of potential cards that holders are carrying significantly, especially in an environment where you potentially have multiple physical access control systems. That's where our conversation around the future of credentialing starts to come into play. Is there an opportunity if you've got people that carry multiple cards to gain access to various facilities to now consolidate down to what I would call the one card wonder, one card to rule them all, that allows you to not only get into any site that you have authorization for, but you can also access your systems with IT knowing that the card holder is who they say they are, in addition to also being able to provision for other services within the organization. Maybe you've got cafeteria roles and responsibilities once those start to ramp up again. What if you could do payment systems from that same card, or be able to check out different technology that you need to take home using that card and integrating with other systems? There's a lot of possibilities. And on top of that, what we're starting to see is that there is a lesser yearly spend in a very short period of time by bringing all these systems into one pane of glass to manage it all. So to give you a little bit of a visual diagram of how this works, and again, very high level workflow. when we tend to get into a workshop engagement to discuss how Convergint can work with you with your existing architecture of various systems and take you over to where you've got this kind of store of governance, where all of your identities are in one place. You've got a rule engine and workflow that kind of outlines what happens if, when, then, and, as well as you've got the ability to do very good reporting because now you've cleaned up and deduplicated all of those databases. The other thing this opens us up to is an incredible amount of business intelligence. Having access to this kind of data allows you to assess not just potential risks within the organization, but can provide the integrations and intelligence to workspace efficiency, to things like COVID self-attestation applications that allows you to provision or deny access based on somebody before they even leave for the office, saying that they were around somebody who was COVID positive. Or, for example, let's think about potentially the new normal. Maybe it's not even COVID anymore. We've all gone through tremendous amount of work over the last year to come up with new workflows and ways of doing business and bringing people back to the office. Why should that go away during the seasonal flu? When we know that there's, people that, and, maybe start to feel sick on the way to work before they leave for work, but know that they need to arrive and get something done that day. Maybe this can also be carried forward as a way to reduce that risk ongoing and keeping a safe and healthy work environment associated with that. So through all that, obviously a lot of high-level options and availability here. But one of the things I think that really comes away from thinking about it in this fashion is that you start to unify the enterprise around a single database, around a system that can do a lot more than just access control. It's now going to be something that interfaces with other business critical infrastructure to get some of the business outcomes that were described previously. And a lot of it comes down to knowing who, what, where, when, by whom, and for how long. Some of the most critical questions when your employees have access to sensitive data as well as intellectual property. So we may be talking through this. Some of it may feel very familiar. Some of it maybe your organization hasn't thought about too much. But I think one thing to note is most organizations we've spoken to are very early in this due diligence phase. And surprisingly enough, a lot of them still have much older card and reader technologies. You'd be surprised how much proximity and IndalaProx are still out there in the world. So with that, what's driving a lot of this change is that there is a substantial convergence between logical and physical security. They want to have the ability to know that the person on the other side of the computer is who they say they are. So we're seeing a lot of IT teams start to issue new laptops with fingerprint on it, or with the smart card where you insert it and it validates your identity and what systems you have access to, which is good. But we're going to talk about a couple of options today that may be able to bridge the gap without having to issue brand new technology, which could create more cost savings and a higher level of authentication. We'll get to that here in a moment. But ultimately, all of this technology should be driving towards a common goal. You want this to be a modern and easy thing for your employee experience. But I think a lot of companies also want it to feel unique. They want it to feel innovative. They want it to feel exciting that you're coming to the office and doing something with your credential to validate who you are within the business. So a few things to think about from a migration perspective. And I'm not going to cover all of them today. And there's a reason to that. And I'll talk about that in a second. But we are going to go a little bit deeper into what HID and Wavelengths are doing in the smart card industry. I'm going to cover Blue Diamond, definitely going to cover Sentry Card because I think that plays into the logical and physical discussion. And I'm also going to talk about Proxy today and their mobile credentialing capabilities. Now, Legion is on here. Legion is a Convergint partner. They have some very exciting things that we are not able to talk about just yet, but later this year, there's going to be some really game-changing mobile opportunities on that front. And why mobile adoption is growing so rapidly, I've got a slide to speak to this a little bit later, but I'll just address it now, is there is a smart chip shortage. Depending on where you're getting your cards, if you're an existing smart card user, or if you're looking at a migration right now, depending on the number of identities you need to secure cards against, you could be looking at lead times anywhere from 12 to 26 weeks, and that's on the near term. Again, this is still getting sorted out. We're getting updated information from our suppliers ongoing. This feels very similar to trying to get a hold of thermal cameras last March. But all that to be said is that organizations are trying to make the shift. They're trying to go to more secure credentialing, and they're trying to do it quickly. So in areas where you may be able to have smartphones, where it's more population-based, where they do tend to carry a smartphone, we're seeing organizations try to get approval or kind of push that approval of the onboard mobile credential and send their physical cards to locations where mobile adoption is not as strong or not on the latest iOS or Android. So with that, what we're also seeing is that touch has kind of started to go by the wayside because everybody wants a touchless experience, less potential for, spreading germs, sanitation requirements, all of that. We're seeing people either step back and put biometrics only where it makes the most sense, or they move entirely to some type of facial recognition, biometric authentication, or touchless. And there's a few different systems out there that can help with that. So that's kind of the state of most organizations. They're going through that journey, trying to understand what are our challenges today, what systems do we have out there, what are the possibilities of integrating all of those, and what are the positive business outcomes that we can achieve if we choose to go down this path. And of course, the obvious questions then become how much and how long for time to value. On top of that, most are still very early in this stage. We've got a few very good projects going on right now that are validating some of our findings. But ultimately, let me educate and talk about some of the new mobile credentialing technologies, as well as what we're seeing from some of the biggest players in the identity space. Now, this isn't meant to be read through by everybody, but again, just a quick snapshot of some of the terminology that I'm going to be talking about today. Everything from the legacy 125 kilohertz proximity cards all the way through to the 13.56 megahertz smart chip cards. The difference between MyFair and DesFire EV1, 2, and now 3 NXP semiconductor chips, and all the way through to the CIOS cards coming from HID. Everything from their iCloss to CIOS. And we're going to talk about CIOS because even though it's been around for a little while, some pretty exciting news about what they just got from a security certification perspective that I think is relevant. And then FIDO2 I'm going to address here in just a moment. But custom keys is another thing, especially at the enterprise level. You would be surprised how many enterprises do not have custom keys. And what that means is essentially only those cards work at your facility and nowhere else in the world. Nobody can duplicate your card to work on their system. So even if somebody were trying to spoof a card, unless they had those custom keys on it, they would not be able to gain access. It wouldn't even be recognized by your reader or your panels. So that's an important thing here when we think about, adding another layer of security to your customization. We're going to talk about some nuances between wavelengths and HID that may be relevant and matter to you when trying to make a decision. So let's talk about FIDO2 real quick. FIDO2 and how that's going to play within the access control space. Today, what it essentially does is it helps store your user-based role within your organization. And usually what it's done is it's an authentication through your browser. So it knows who you are and allows those app calls to be applied when you get on your laptop. This is an authentication standard that is coming very quickly. And you see a lot of identity platforms, Ping Identity being one of those, that uses the FIDO2 standard for a lot of their integrations. And so what does that mean, having FIDO2 on a access credential? Well, the smart card can actually hold information. It can hold biometrics, it can hold FIDO2 information, right? And what that allows to do when you present it to your laptop, that FIDO2 authentication is going to allow you access based on your user roles and privileges within the organization. So it helps to eliminate the number of usernames and passwords and those resets that were mentioned earlier that have been burdening IT outside of business hours. that have to take place. And this can be applied not just to a physical credential, but it also works with the mobile credentials as well, where these same FIDO2 capabilities can be applied and utilized within the organization. So in those cases, and we see this in healthcare a lot and in banking, where you've got one card to gain access to a facility, but you've got a second card that gives you the logical access that you insert into your laptop to gain access to locations. That is going by the wayside, where we can now combine the two into a single card and user experience. So again, lots of external authentication options with your phone, with your watch, via Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, USB, a variety of possibilities that this opens up. So let's talk a little bit about HID and what they're doing with SEAS. So today, obviously they've had this technology out for a while, but it's a very proprietary yet effective way of being able to apply encryption between the card or the mobile device and the reader itself. A lot of this is being done, in a way that doesn't allow you, one, to steal the credential, and two, really ensures authentication that if you've got custom keys, for example, that the reader and the credential can communicate together before it even sends anything back to the panel for validation against an identity database, your access rights, access levels. And the purpose behind all of that and these different encryption rates and capabilities is speed. Speed is incredibly important because sometimes this information can take a little bit of time, if it's done correctly, to translate between the different devices and the panels at the head end. In addition to that, we're also concerned about read range, right? We won't want the user trying to hold their badge up and then having to touch it with their card, right? That's always been a concern, especially around some of the earlier smart card technologies, is you got to be right up against the reader. They're getting better now to where you can have further away interaction with the reader and make it a little bit easier process for somebody just walking by the door to hold up their badge and scan in and go through the door. So all that plays into the user experience. But what really was exciting to see from a HID perspective is the fact that they went through the EAL5 security certification, and it is rated as one of the most secure credentials in the world. And what that essentially does is provides peace of mind that if you're going to use this for additional types of secure authentication, for example, holding biometric data on the card. One of the benefits of that, especially when we start to talk about touchless biometrics, is the fact that you could have the card be read at that touchless biometric reader, and then it's going to pass off those biometric credentials to the reader, where then you can validate that you are the person and the appropriate person to be holding that card and gaining entry into the facility. So now you can do away with that external database associated with the various fingerprints that could be PII, could be prohibited based on maybe GDPR and how that data is being stored, as well as passed to various systems and who has access to those. So being able to have more data on card, and me being the holder of that card, having control of that, starts to eliminate some of those PII concerns around it. So this was something that was a little bit of FUD out there for a little while around HID, why their card hadn't been exposed to any security certifications. Well, that has been put to rest. So SEAS is a very good potential fit within your organization. And why could it be a fit? Let's talk about that real quick. So obviously HID's got a long-standing history, size, scale, and global support. I don't think anybody's going to deny that. But one of the things about the card is that it's software-based. So it can be upgraded with firmware or updates to protect against future threats. If there is some way of being able to hack this card, they could pass updates to where you wouldn't have to completely rip and replace all of your cards across your organization and have a bunch of useless cards. You'd actually be in a position where you could just upgrade the firmware of your smart card and go on with your business. And obviously that microprocessor in there can now allow you to be utilizing it for more use cases than just physical security. It introduces logical, introduces pay systems, parking, you name it. So there's a lot of opportunity that can be had by migrating to the smart card, really future-proofing some of the business initiatives. Now, from a cons perspective, in a lot of cases, to be able to gain mobile or even CIOS capability, you are going to have to upgrade your readers. And in a lot of cases, that's not a bad thing, right? Being able to go to a more modern, more secure reader, especially if you're in a position where you've got legacy procs, yeah, you're going to have to upgrade it. That's a no-brainer. So I wouldn't really put it in a cons, more of a consideration standpoint. But to be able to gain mobile access in most of these instances, you're going to have to add some either Bluetooth enabled adapter or completely refresh it. There can be longer lead times here. So this is where I get into the conversation around custom keys with HID. Now, in this case, HID owns and holds your custom keys for you. When I think about, let's equate it to blockchain, and maybe this won't be the perfect example for everybody, but when I think about, the difference between me buying Bitcoin and holding it in my own wallet versus me buying it on an exchange, well, the exchange owns the keys to my crypto in that case. Very similar in this case with HID. So are you okay with them holding it, or would you prefer to be the one that controls not only who has access to it, but who you share that with? When it comes to third-party integrations, you do have to go through an approval process with HID in the event that you did want to integrate with parking systems or payment systems. So something we've seen organizations need to consider. And then the firmware updates for the Elite program can be a little bit cumbersome at times. They're still working through this. It's still a newer program, especially on that future threat capability. The fact that you can do it is amazing, but it's still in its infancy, and they're still working through some. How do you get that out there to the masses in a very fast fashion versus having to send all your cards into a security operations center to perform that feature function. So that's something I know that they're continuing to evolve to support at scale. Now let's talk a little bit about wavelengths. They've been around for a while here, but they've taken a little bit different approach using the leaf memory structure. We're going to talk about what leaf is here in a moment. But as you can tell, and this is architected in a very similar way to the CIOS card, they're using the DesFire MyFair EV1, 2, and 3 protocols to be able to do data transfer between a card and the access control system. So obviously, same concept where you can still have biometrics on there, various different campus applications for checking out technology, food services, you name it. So fundamentally, not too many differences just in terms of the card structure and how it retains data and what you can do with it. What it does do here is, from a leaf perspective, it's defined to allow for the customer to own those custom keys. And so you've got the ability then to do what's known as a key ceremony to pass those along to a third-party application that you want to be able to build something for your organization. So holders of that card get access to something unique within your organization. And the fact that it's a standard doesn't mean that you have to pay licensing fees then to perform that function. You don't have to go through anything external from an approval process perspective. It also guarantees that that device that's going to have those custom keys on it will be compatible. So when you go and migrate to a card like this, it opens up the possibilities of a very high adoption rate for more use cases than just security. So in that case, Wavelengths does offer some interesting possibilities. So let's talk about pros and cons here real quick. Obviously, that custom key set owned and managed by you is very secure, and they use OSDP on existing cabling. So with that, you may or may not have to upgrade your existing reader infrastructure, something we would have to look at and talk through a little bit. As mentioned before, that third-party key ceremony, again, very easy to facilitate, internal to all of you on your own paper, NDAs, all of those things. And coming soon, if you're still using something like an Indala legacy proximity technology, they will have an integration in QFAR with their multi-class technology readers that gives you access to migrate to mobile or any one of the smart technologies. Now, one of the things on the mobile side, and I may have messed this up, so I'm gonna own this real quick. On the MyPass mobile, you can actually issue that same custom key set. So you've got that path for physical and mobile credentialings. That is not a con, so that was my fault. That's a good thing. The fact that you can apply that same level of encryption and custom key set to a mobile credential and still use that mobile phone to be able to get the same services and access as everybody else carrying a physical credential, that's a pretty big win. Now, from a cons perspective, Wavelengths is still a small company, right? They're not going anywhere. I'm not concerned about that. Only 50 employees. They've got some large customers, but an acquisition by somebody could result in a potential lost investment if they acquire and do away with their existing technology. So that is a potential risk. So we're still understanding and vetting from that perspective what sized opportunities and enterprises make the most sense. You may decide the custom keys is a huge win and go forward, which does tend to have a higher cost for the full reader migration, especially on the mobile side. So you have a couple of things to think about here between the two technologies that may be worthwhile or not. Again, apologies for screwing up the pros versus cons there, but I think you all get it. So I'm not going to ask you to read this. I'm not going to read through this. The good news is this recording is going to be sent out into the world, so you can actually scroll back or even Google this and take a look at the differences between the two technologies. On their face, a lot of similarities. Both of them score very high as EAL5 certified credentials. And I think that's probably the core piece of it. Now it's about determining what path makes the most sense for your existing ecosystem, the access control systems you have in place, as well as how you want to future-proof that from a third-party application perspective. So now we're going to move into talking about the Sentry Card. And I know a few of you have probably heard about this. Where I'm starting to see substantial traction with this are in those use cases specific to that IT logical physical convergence. I'm going to play a little video here real quick because I think it's relevant. But as you can see, when you place that proximity card up to the reader, it doesn't work. But when you apply your fingerprint tied only to you as the user, that's when it works. It exposes even legacy proximity technology only when the fingerprint is present. So let's think about a couple of use cases here. Something that was common, surprisingly common during the last year, is finding out the fact that there were actually people that, let's say spouse. One spouse was more employable than another. Somebody else was laid off just because of their role. They couldn't find work. Well, the employable individual passed off all of their information to be able to do their job day to day, and that employable individual went out and got a job. We found several instances across many of our enterprises where people were essentially becoming their spouse or roommate's worker. And so in that case, they wouldn't have known unless, in a few cases, there were some slip-ups, which led to finding this out in a variety of ways. Unless you're actually there checking in with some type of biometric recognition, no matter what kind of card you're using, you can, I could hand this off to my wife. She could come in, plug in the card or use it throughout the day and, could even potentially probably be doing a better job with this presentation. Who knows, right? So with that, I think one of the benefits of the Sentry Card, and one of many at the end of the day, that I think is worth exploring, is the fact that once you program it with the biometric on the card, that can never be reprogrammed. That card is tied to that individual. Now, obviously, that puts a higher burden on that person not losing it because there's an increased cost comparatively to the other cards I've shown you. However, if both gaining access to your facility as well as your systems requires biometric verification without the requirement of rolling out biometric readers, biometric databases, and figuring out, should I have it at the edge? Should I have it on a separate database? Should I have it on card? But rather completely taking that off the table and reducing those costs, you've got something that, stays GDPR compliant because you have no database associated with it. If this card was lost, you couldn't tell it was Doug Greenwald's card nor could you pull the fingerprint off of it to be able to go to an external database and run it and find out who I was. So the security is unparalleled. The fact that proximity is not exposed within this card unless your fingerprint is present is a huge win for organizations with a lot of readers that don't necessarily have a cost analysis or consideration for migrating to the latest reader technologies. On top of that, this will be FIDO2 enabled. So from an IT perspective, if you're looking at refreshes of technology, whether that's going to be biometrics on the computer, or you are currently using smart cards to insert and gain access, what better way then to use this and expose either the smart chip or the NFC, near field communication with the laptop to validate your identity to gain access to your systems. No more username, no more password. You've been validated twice by both the card that you carry and by your biometric on card. And if throughout the day you require validation every hour, every 2 hours, well, that then reduces or eliminates the risk of it being spoofed by some other individual who's gained access to that credential. So I think there's a tremendous use case here, one that is continuously evolving, especially through technology retrofits that are taking place, especially IT organizations trying to get a handle in the field of who's using their systems and using biometrics as that kind of stopgap to achieve that. This could be a very viable option. And you can get this card with both Prox and a SEAS or an EV2 Wavelengths custom key enabled card. So if you're using proximity today, you can maintain and use the Prox card today and migrate over your readers over time to get to that more secure credential on the SEAS or the EV2 side. So a lot of use cases, a lot of opportunity with the Sentry Card from a modernization perspective. I touched on this earlier, but I'll reiterate it. And none of the previous manufacturers that I've just spoken about are immune to what's happening in terms of a global shortage of computer chips. And this applies to this industry as well. As mentioned before, we're seeing anywhere from 12 to 26 weeks. We're still tracking that. That's a big swing. So we're hoping that manufacturing ramps up because there are a lot of companies looking at this migration right now and trying to make a decision on what direction to go, which brings me to the mobile credentialing side of things. With this, obviously, it's pretty cost effective because most people aren't going to lose their phone, but it's pretty easy to lose a credential. So to issue this, pretty easy, cost effective. In most cases, if you go over to some of these platforms, they're not even charging a per individual license. They're just charging based on the size of the enterprise. So the pricing model is evolving today much more rapidly into a place where it's starting to make a little bit more sense. Obviously, being able to unlock a door without ever having to take out your phone is a new feature that's starting to come to some of these systems. Imagine just because of Bluetooth, I'm walking towards a door and my phone is in my back pocket, it's in your purse. And as you walk up, all you have to do is wave your hand in front of the reader and it recognizes you, sees that you're within proximity and it opens the door for you. That's a great touchless experience, especially if the doors are associated with operators. So it seems to take us now a little bit closer into that Star Trek world where we want to walk up to the door and it just opens for us because it knows who I am and why I'm there. And so those are some of the key areas. And of course, same level of encryption, same level of key technology, especially the custom key piece to it, applies to these credentials as well. Fully encrypted, in transit, at rest, cannot be stolen off of your phone. So, and pushing these out, whether it's through an email, right? And from your phone being able to download the credential or simply getting a text. If I'm a visitor, how great would that be for me to just get my visitor credential for the day issued to me because I checked in at a visitor management station and it issued me a mobile credential to the phone that I checked in with. This simplifies the need for having cards on hand that you can issue to people that could still be kept or lost after that person leaves, as well as revoking those access rights immediately following that person's visit where they're only provisioned for a short period of time. So it goes back to the original do you know who's authorized to have access to your facilities, when and where? And if you want to really track and have compliance around who's in your facilities, what better way than issuing visitors and contractors a mobile credential where they would only be provisioned for the duration of their visit. And you'd be able to track all of that against that specific identity that was logged in your system tied to that email or phone number. So this is where we kind of come into where Linnell, and again, the information on the screen isn't meant to be read and talked to ad nauseum, but really just to give you a snapshot of what they're doing. So they've got a migration path to be able to take advantage of the DesFire EV2 capabilities, a lot of the HID stuff that's coming forth, and more. And a lot of this is being driven by mobile credential adoption. And so you've got, this Bluetooth enabled module that needs to be added to existing readers, either in pair, or you can just buy the upgraded version that gives you, access to all of the reader technologies, right? And same process where you just kind of walk up with your phone and it gives you entry. And again, a lot of this is playing into what is the user experience? What does it need to look like? How much time are you spending issuing physical credentials? How often are they being lost or forgotten? And what's the burden on your local teams to facilitate that? In addition to, what are your goals here with regards to migrating to a more secure credential? If it's something where you're trying to migrate the whole enterprise and you don't have access to cards because of the shortage right now and you want to find a stopgap to still meet those goals, then start talking policy around having BYOD devices have a mobile credential for access into the facility. Again, one of the educational points of all of this is that just because you have a credential issued by your organization does not mean they have access to anything on your phone, nor are you giving up any rights associated with that. So there's some education that needs to still occur with the user base to understand that this is not a risk to your personal safety, to the organization, or you're giving access to things on your phone that you otherwise wouldn't just by having this credential added to your phone. So more to come on that. But the last one I want to kind of address is what Proxy is doing in the space. And this is one of those solutions that is allowing for the no phone access, right? You could have your phone just on your person, in your purse, and you wave your hand at the reader and gain access. And it's using Weekend OSDP with all of the legacy and new cloud platforms coming into the space. And it gives you a dashboard that allows you to secure and manage all of your identities that are going to be a part of this ecosystem. So it's a very clean user interface. It's a great alternative to some of the other platforms that I've shared. They've been growing very rapidly. Another one of these kind of cloud first platforms that's making their way into the industry, that's being adopted by some of the cloud first access control platforms as one of their partners of choice. So this may be something to also take a look at, do a little bit of a deep dive on. Again, really just trying to give some exposure today. If you haven't heard of them, it may be worth your time to check out. So with that, we are just about at time, 2 minutes left. Look at that. And I hope you hung on for the entire time. I know it was a lot of information. Hopefully it was valuable for companies just starting to get their mind wrapped around technology refresh, modernization, how to secure their cards in a more meaningful way, and where we see some of the best applications going as of today. Now, obviously, this is going to continue to evolve. We're going to continue to do insights. I will continue to refresh this deck as more information becomes available, as Legion has updates on their mobile program. But with that, I'm going to take a look real quick, see what questions there are. So if I'm reading this question correctly, is the credential reader able to access other databases from where the credential is housed? I'm not sure I'm tracking, so let me try and think about that real quick. When I think of where the credential is housed, so I think the physical credential itself is on the person, whether it's a mobile or it's an actual physical card. The database is where we're trying to figure out what's that single source of truth, but it will always populate that individual, their access rights and access levels and time zones into the access control system. So the reader will always tie back to the access control. The credential will always be tied to that reader to provision or to authenticate that user coming into the facility. So there's no bi-directional communication where the access control would push a person back towards Workday or back towards the IT security system. It would be designed in that way where the workflow is one way only for onboarding, offboarding. If someone is removed from access control manually, then there'd be a notification back to the identity management solution, notifying that that took place outside of normal processes. That'd be part of the business intelligence that'd be going into it. So there's not a lot of risk where, you know, the reader would be accessed from Workday or provisioned from Workday specifically or anything like that. So I don't know if that answered your question. I wasn't too clear on it. I apologize if I totally butchered that. But that's one of the stopgaps and safety protocols we have where, you know, we don't want data to be pushed back towards that single source of truth, back into HR based on changes that are manually performed in the platform. In fact, we want to alert on those, identify who made those changes, and correct them if they are inaccurate. So we're past time. All right, awesome. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it was insightful. And with that, again, Doug Greenwald with the Convergint Technologies Digital Transformation Team. I've got my email up on the screen. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them to me. Otherwise, get with your account executive. They'd be happy to facilitate a one-on-one session with me where I can really dig in on your specific ecosystem architecture and use cases to put together the absolute best solution based on the technology we have today for you and your organization. With that, enjoy the rest of your time at Insight. Have a great week.